The first thing that hit me was the smell. Not the sweet smell of baking bread or the comforting scent of warm stew, no. This was harsher. Smoke from the grate half clung to the air, mingled with the sharp tang of onions, the sour staleness of spilled ale, and a greasy weight of meat fat sizzling somewhere in the shadows. My eyes stung, and I hadn't even taken 3 steps inside. The kitchen was a world of its own, alive and roaring. The stone walls trapped the heat, making the place feel more like a forge than a room for food. Men and women hurried about, aprons stained, sleeves rolled, hair tied back with strips of cloth already dark with sweat. The clang of ladles, the hiss of pans, the bark of orders all rose together into a deafening rhythm. It wasn't a kitchen, it was a battlefield. I hadn't meant to end up here. A simple errand, they said. Carry a basket of eggs from the hen house to the kitchen, and I would be on my way. Yet the moment I stepped through the heavy wooden door, the cook, a round woman with arms thick as hams and a voice like a drum, caught sight of me. You there, don't just stand gaping. Set those eggs down careful, mind you, and fetch the firewood. We're near out. Her word was law. The entire kitchen seemed to move to her commands. Before I could argue, a boy no older than me shoved a bundle of sticks into my arms and pointed toward the hearth. The fire was monstrous, a pit of glowing coals big enough to roast an ox, flames licking the blackened stones. I edged closer, heat biting at my skin, until I tossed the wood into the flames and stumbled back, my heart racing. Faster! The cook bellowed. Dinner waits for no fool. Lord Geoffrey will have his feast by nightfall, and if the bread burns or the meat cools, it'll be my hide and yours too, Lord Geoffrey. The name alone tightened my stomach. I had heard the stories. A temper quick as flint, a taste for rich food, and no patience for failure. This feast wasn't. Just any meal, it was a display of wealth and power. And here I was, trapped in the chaos, a clumsy stranger among seasoned hands. I tried to slip away after the firewood, but the cook's eyes found me again. You egg boy, to the table! Chop those onions. Onions. It sounded simple enough, but the pile was a mountain and the knife was heavy, its edge nicked from use. I hacked at the first onion, juice spraying, eyes burning until tears streamed down my face. The others moved like lightning, knives flashing, vegetables falling into neat piles. My clumsy cuts earned me curses and elbows, but no mercy. Keep up, or I'll set you gutting fish, snarled the boy beside me, his hands moving so fast they blurred. I gritted my teeth, blinking through the sting, and forced myself to keep chopping. The smell of onion filled my nose, layered over the smoke and meat. My hand slipped, nearly cutting my finger, and I gasped. The boy smirked. Best not bleed in the stew. Cook won't forgive that. Ours blurred. Firewood, onions, scrubbing pots black with soot, carrying buckets of water so heavy my arms shook. Each task led to another, and every time I thought I might slip away, the cook's booming voice pinned me in place. By midday, sweat soaked my tunic, grime streaked my arms, and my head throbbed with the heat. Yet there was no pause, no chance to rest. Bread needed kneading, meat turning on the spit, herbs chopped fine as dust. And all the while, I could feel the weight of the feast pressing down. This was not just cooking, it was survival. For the cooks, for the servants, for me. One wrong step, one ruined dish, and the wrath of the Lord would fall upon us all. As the day stretched ahead, I realized something chilling. This was only the beginning. Tonight, there would be a feast, and if I was to make it through this day alive, I would have to learn the rules of the kitchen fast. The kitchen never truly grew quiet, but by afternoon it changed rhythm. The roar of chopping and shouting eased into something sharper, faster, more desperate. The feast hour was drawing closer. I carried a bucket of water from the well, the handle biting into my palms. When I set it down, steam rose as it splashed onto the hearthstones. The cook was everywhere at once, ordering one servant to baste the goose, another to grind spices, another to sweep the rushes. Her voice was iron, holding the chaos together. Then came the taster. He strode in with 2 guards behind him, wearing fine wool. His nose lifted as though the very air was beneath him. I had heard of men like him appointed by the Lord to taste every dish, before it reached the high table, not for flavor but for poison. Where is the broth? He demanded. At once. A steaming bowl was set before him. The kitchen fell silent as he dipped a spoon, sipped, and waited. My breath caught. One twitch, one cough, one fall to the floor, and heads would roll. At last, he set the spoon down. Acceptable. The room released its breath in unison, and the noise rushed back like a wave. I returned to my work, scrubbing the fish scales from a slab of cod, but my hands trembled. Poison. Was that what we feared? Suddenly every spice jar, every herb bundle looked dangerous. Don't stare like a fool, hissed the boy beside me. The taste is nothing. Worry about the cook. She'll gut you quicker than any poison. As if to prove him right, the cook clapped her hands like thunder. Listen well. The Lord himself will come through the kitchens soon to see his feast. If he finds slack hands or lazy backs, he'll send you to the stocks or worse. Keep moving. The thought of Lord Geoffrey striding in here made my knees weak. I was already drowning in heat, smoke, and noise. How could I endure the gaze of a man whose word could end my life with less thought than crushing a fly? But there was no escape. The kitchen was a trap and the feast a test. And as the shadows of evening crept closer, I began to understand the truth. Surviving this day would not only mean keeping the fire hot, and the meat unburnt, it would mean surviving the Lord's gaze itself. The air in the kitchen thickened as the sun sank low, and the fires burned hotter than ever. The great spits groaned as they turned, venison roasting until golden fat hissed into the flames. The noise was constant clattering pots, shouting voices. The dull thump of cleavers striking wood, but beneath it all beat a single truth. The feast was almost upon us. I was handed a mortar and pestle nearly as heavy as my arms. Peppercorns, barked the boy beside me. Grind them fine, or cook will have your ears. The black seeds cracked and spat beneath the stone, releasing a sharp, stinging scent that clawed at my nose. I sneezed once, then twice, nearly tipping the bowl. The boy laughed, but his grin vanished when the cook loomed behind us, her face dark with sweat and fury. Do you think the Lord dines on clumps and dust? She thundered, snatching the pestle from my hand. Careless grinding means careless tongues. One grain too many and you'll choke him. My cheeks burned hotter than the hearth. I bowed my head, muttering an apology, but she was already off, her voice booming orders across the room. Then came disaster. On the far side of the kitchen, a girl staggered under the weight of a pot filled with steaming wine sauce. Her foot caught on a loose rush, and in an instant the pot tipped, spilling its dark, fragrant contents across the stones. The liquid hissed where it met the fire, and the smell of ruined wine filled the air. The kitchen froze. The girl stared in horror, her lips trembling, as the cook's roar shattered the silence. You waste the Lord's sauce? On your knees, scrub it clean, or I'll see you thrown out to beg scraps with the dogs. She dropped at once, her hands raw against the stones, trying in vain to gather what could not be saved. I swallowed hard. If spilled sauce brought such wrath, what punishment would come if the Lord himself saw failure? Before I could dwell on it, a bell tolled from above the first guests arriving. Panic surged through the kitchen. Servants rushed with polished platters, bread was sliced in neat rounds, goblets filled to the brim. The air grew so thick with heat and noise I could barely think. Then the shouting ceased. A shadow fell across the room, and I heard a voice deeper than the growl of the hearth. Lord Geoffrey had entered. Tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in velvet trimmed with fur, he walked with slow, deliberate steps. Rings glittered on his fingers as he inspected the platters, the meats, the bread, saying nothing. His silence was worse than shouting. It pressed down on us all like a weight. When his eyes swept past me, my knees almost buckled. For a heartbeat, I thought he might stop, demand to know who I was and why I dared stand in his kitchen. But he moved on, his gaze fixed on the next servant. I exhaled, trembling. The feast was beginning. The fires burned hotter, the air grew tighter, and the unspoken truth curled in my chest. If one dish failed, if one hand faltered, this kitchen would not just face anger, it would face ruin. And I was caught in the middle of it. The air in the kitchen thickened as the sun sank low, and the fires burned hotter than ever. The great spits groaned as they turned, venison roasting until golden fat hissed into the flames. The noise was constant clattering pots, shouting voices. The dull thump of cleavers striking would but beneath it all beat a single truth. The feast was almost upon us. I was handed a mortar and pestle nearly as heavy as my arms. Peppercorns, barked the boy beside me. Grind them fine, or cook will have your ears. The black seeds cracked and spat beneath the stone, releasing a sharp, stinging scent that clawed at my nose. I sneezed once, then twice, nearly tipping the bowl. The boy laughed, but his grin vanished when the cook loomed behind us, her face dark with sweat and fury. "Do you think the Lord dines on clumps and dust?" she thundered, snatching the pestle from my hand. "Careless grinding means careless tongues. One grain too many and you'll choke him." My cheeks burned hotter than the hearth. I bowed my head, muttering an apology, but she was already off, her voice booming orders across the room. Then came disaster. On the far side of the kitchen, a girl staggered under the weight of a pot filled with steaming wine sauce. Her foot caught on a loose rush, and in an instant the pot tipped, spilling its dark, fragrant contents across the stones. The liquid hissed where it met the fire, and the smell of ruined wine filled the air. The kitchen froze. The girl stared in horror, her lips trembling, as the cook's roar shattered the silence. "You waste the Lord's sauce? On your knees, scrub it clean, or I'll see you thrown out to beg scraps with the dogs." She dropped at once, her hands raw against the stones, trying in vain to gather what could not be saved. I swallowed hard. If spilled sauce brought such wrath, what punishment would come if the Lord himself saw failure? Before I could dwell on it, a bell tolled from above the first guests arriving. Panic surged through the kitchen. Servants rushed with polished platters. Bread was sliced in neat rounds, goblets filled to the brim. The air grew so thick with heat and noise I could barely think. Then the shouting ceased. A shadow fell across the room, and I heard a voice deeper than the growl of the hearth. Lord Geoffrey had entered. Tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in velvet trimmed with fur, he walked with slow, deliberate steps. Rings glittered on his fingers as he inspected the platters, the meats, the bread, saying nothing. His silence was worse than shouting. It pressed down on us all like a weight. When his eyes swept past me, my knees almost buckled. For a heartbeat, I thought he might stop, demand to know who I was and why I dared stand in his kitchen. But he moved on, his gaze fixed on the next servant. I exhaled, trembling. The feast was beginning. The fires burned hotter, the air grew tighter, and the unspoken truth curled in my chest. If one dish failed, if one hand faltered, this kitchen would not just face anger, it would face ruin. And I was caught in the middle of it. The goose was gone, carried into the great hall, but the kitchen's chaos did not ease. If anything, it grew sharper. The feast was in full swing, and every moment demanded more food, more drink, more labor, more trenchers, shouted one servant, shoving stacks of wooden plates into my arms. The guests eat like wolves. Before I could set them down, another hand thrust a jug of ale at me. Upstairs quickly. I staggered back and forth, up the stairs and down again, carrying jugs, trays, and plates until my legs ached and my vision blurred with sweat. The great hall glittered each time I entered, candles blazing, banners swaying, goblets raised high. Laughter rolled like thunder, but every laugh seemed edged with danger. Every glance from the steward like a blade. When I returned to the kitchen, a new task awaited, kneading bread. A lump of heavy dough was slapped onto the table before me, sticky and tough. The boy beside me smirked. "Let's see if your soft hands can do this." I pressed my palms into the dough, folding, stretching, slamming it against the table until my arms shook. At first, the others jeered at my clumsiness, but as minutes passed, something shifted. The rhythm came to me: push, fold, turn. My hands found their strength. The cook glanced over, her sharp eyes narrowing. For the first time, she gave a curt nod instead of a curse. There was no time to savor it. A cry rose near the hearth. The fish. It burns. I rushed to see a pan blackening over the fire, the boy assigned to it frozen in panic. Without thinking, I grabbed a cloth, yanked the pan aside, and scraped the fish free before it was lost. Smoke filled my eyes, but when I set the dish on the table, the cook's heavy hand landed on my shoulder. "Quick hands," she said, voice low enough only I could hear. Perhaps you're lost the night after all. The words lit a fire in me stronger than the hearth itself. For the first time, I was not just surviving, I was useful. Still, the night was far from safe. The steward's sharp eyes never left the kitchen, and every dish that left our hands carried the weight of life or death. As the hours dragged on, I realized something. This kitchen was not just a place of sweat and fire. It was a battlefield of will, and if I was to endure it, I would need more than luck. I would need to prove myself again and again until the final dish left the table. The goose was gone, carried into the great hall, but the kitchen's chaos did not ease. If anything, it grew sharper. The feast was in full swing, and every moment demanded more food. More drink, more labor, more trenchers, shouted one servant, shoving stacks of wooden plates into my arms. The guests eat like wolves. Before I could set them down, another hand thrust a jug of ale at me. Upstairs quickly. I staggered back and forth, up the stairs and down again, carrying jugs, trays, and plates until my legs ached and my vision blurred with sweat. The great hall glittered each time I entered, candles blazing, banners swaying, goblets raised high, laughter rolled like thunder. But every laugh seemed edged with danger, every glance from the steward like a blade. When I returned to the kitchen, a new task awaited, kneading bread. A lump of heavy dough was slapped onto the table before me, sticky and tough. The boy beside me smirked. "Let's see if your soft hands can do this." I pressed my palms into the dough, folding, stretching, slamming it against the table until my arms shook. At first, the others jeered at my clumsiness, but as minutes passed, something shifted. The rhythm came to me: push, fold, turn. My hands found their strength. The cook glanced over, her sharp eyes narrowing. For the first time, she gave a curt nod instead of a curse. There was no time to savor. A cry rose near the hearth. "The fish, it burns." I rushed to see a pan blackening over the fire, the boy assigned to it frozen in panic. Without thinking, I grabbed a cloth, yanked the pan aside, and scraped the fish free before it was lost. Smoke filled my eyes, but when I set the dish on the table, the cook's heavy hand landed on my shoulder. "Quick hands," she said, voice low enough only I could hear. "Perhaps you'll last the night after all." The words lit a fire in me stronger than the hearth itself. For the first time, I was not just surviving, I was useful. Still, the night was far from safe. The steward's sharp eyes never left the kitchen, and every dish that left our hands carried the weight of life or death. As the hours dragged on, I realized something. This kitchen was not just a place of sweat and fire. It was a battlefield of will, and if I was to endure it, I would need more than luck. I would need to prove myself again and again until the final dish left the table. The night stretched on like a trial by fire, and the kitchen showed no mercy. Flames roared in the great hearth, spitting sparks into the smoky air. The scent of roasting meats, boiling stews, and scorched bread tangled together into something that made my stomach churn. Sweat trickled down, my temples stinging my eyes, but I dared not wipe it away. Around me, servants shouted, knives clattered, and pans hissed. The feast above demanded a river of food, and we were the flood struggling to keep pace. Then came the order that froze the room. For an instant, "Boy," barked the cook, her sharp voice carrying even over the chaos. "Take this." Platter boar's head, Lord Geoffrey demands it at once. The room seemed to tilt as the massive platter was thrust into my hands. Upon it rested the roasted boar's head, a grotesque and majestic centerpiece. Its jaw was pried open with apples, and herbs stuffed inside. Its tusks gleamed like ivory blades, and its charred skin shone with honey glaze. The smell was thick and heavy, rich enough to sicken a hungry stomach. The dish was as much a weapon as a meal. One wrong step, and it would destroy me. My arms quivered immediately under the weight, but there was no time to falter. Two servants with smaller trays rushed beside me, and together we climbed the steep stair toward the hall. Above, the roar of voices grew louder, cheers, laughter, the hammering of mugs against wood in a rhythm that felt like war drums. When the doors opened, the sight beyond nearly stole my breath. The great hall was alive with fire and light. Hundreds of candles burned in iron chandeliers, their flames casting gold across banners of crimson and black, Nobles sat shoulder to shoulder along long tables, their clothes shimmering with silks and furs, their goblets overflowing with wine. The smell of perfume and roasted meat hit me at once, dizzying after the smoke of the kitchen. At the far end of the hall, beneath the grandest banner of all, sat Lord Geoffrey. He lounged like a predator at rest, his velvet cloak trimmed with white fur, his fingers heavy with rings that glinted in the light. He drummed those jeweled fingers against the arm of his chair as if waiting for prey to approach. The steward guided us forward with a quick snap of his hand. Set it before his lordship, he ordered under his breath. My heart pounded so hard I feared the nobles could hear it. My arms screamed with the weight of the platter, every step a battle. The floor between me and Geoffrey stretched longer with every pace, though in truth it was only a dozen strides. Finally, we reached the high table and lowered the dish with trembling precision. The feast above thundered on like a storm, yet the kitchen below never slowed. Platters came and went, knives clattered, and fires roared until the air itself seemed alive. My arms ached, my hands burned, but I dared not stop. Still, Lord Geoffrey's eyes haunted me, the way he had fixed his gaze on me, the weight of his command to eat, the laughter that followed. I carried it like a brand upon my back. Not everyone ignored me now. The scullion who had mocked me earlier smirked as he passed me a tray of trenchers. Not bad, boy. Didn't faint like I thought you would. It wasn't quite praise, but it was more than I had expected. Even the cook's silence felt different. She didn't scold me for every slip of the knife or stumble of the hand. Once or twice, I thought I even caught her watching me with something almost like approval. Then disaster struck again. A servant slipped in spilled ale, sending a tray of roasted birds crashing to the floor. The smell of grease and herbs filled the room as the meat rolled into the dirt. The steward's fury descended like a thunderclap. "Do you mean to shame us before the Lord?" he roared, his gaze snapping toward me. "You clean it. Replace it. Now." I dropped to my knees, gathering ruined meat with shaking hands. The cook shoved fresh birds into my arms, her voice low and urgent. "Go, quickly. Do not give him another excuse." My heart thundered as I carried the tray back up the stair, but this time my steps were sure. The nobles barely looked at me when I replaced the dish, too lost in their wine and song. When I returned, the cook's nod was small but real, a gesture that said more than words could. As the hours dragged on, exhaustion settled over us like a heavy cloak. The nobles' laughter turned slurred, the music grew slower, and the candles in the hall burned low. In the smoky quiet of the kitchen, whispers passed between weary servants. They spoke of the feast's true purpose, that Geoffrey sought more than celebration. This was a show of strength, a gathering to seal new alliances. Each dish we sent up was not only food, but proof of wealth, power and control. The thought chilled me. The kitchen was no longer just fire and sweat, it was the hidden heart of the castle. What we carried on our platters could shape the Lord's fortunes or ruin them. At last, as dawn's pale light touched the narrow windows, the chaos eased. Platters returned empty, goblets drained, the fires dimmed and silence settled in the weary room. I leaned against the cool stone wall, my legs trembling beneath me, every muscle aching. The cook approached, her face shadowed in the dying glow of the hearth. She studied me for ale. The first light of dawn crept into the kitchen, pale and cold, piercing through the smoke that clung stubbornly to the air. What had been a roaring storm of fire, shouting, and endless dishes was now nothing more than wreckage. The long tables sagged beneath, bones gnawed, clean, trenchers soaked with ale, and scraps of bread hardened to stone. Grease licked the floors, the scent of char and spilled wine clinging to the stones like a curse. We moved among the ruin like ghosts. Our eyes were sunken, our movements slow, each task heavier than it should have been. I scrubbed at pans blackened with soot until my arms shook, the iron biting cold into my blistered hands. Every scrape echoed through the chamber like a reminder of the night's torment. No one spoke. We were all too tired for words, to warn, to even curse the work. Above us, the nobles had collapsed into slumber, their laughter long gone, but I could still hear it in my mind echoing cruelly, mocking the silence we now endured. Their feast had ended in merriment, yet here below, the true cost was counted in aching bodies, raw skin and hollow stares. The cook moved through the wreckage with the same sharpness as before. Though even she carried the weight of the night in her step, she inspected every table, every pot, every scrap, ensuring no failure lingered behind. When her gaze finally landed on me, she stopped. Her eyes swept over my blistered hands. The ash smeared across my arms, the tremor in my shoulders. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, at last, her voice cut through the silence. "You lived through the night," she said, quiet but steady. "That is more than most on their first." It was no gentle praise, yet the words struck me harder than a slap, for in them was something I had not expected acknowledgement. The cook, who had treated me as little more than a burden, had admitted I had endured. That was worth more than any laughter from the hall above. Still, her words carried a shadow. Surviving once was not enough. I understood it then. This kitchen was not a single battle, but a war without end. The fires would burn again tonight, and the night after, each one demanding more of us. Survival here was not victory. It was only the first step, and it would have to be taken again and again until survival itself became second nature. As the bells rang for morning prayers, the sound echoing through the stone halls of the castle, I wiped the last smear of soot from the table and let my shoulders fall. For the first time since the feast began, I allowed myself a breath. The morning had brought no comfort, only the truth. I had survived the night, but as the pale sun rose higher, painting the world in cold light, I knew my next trial would come soon enough. The castle stirred slowly in the grey light of morning, the stones still cold from the night's long feast, while the nobles lay heavy in their chambers, wrapped in furs and dreams of wine. The kitchen was roused once more. There was no rest for us. The cook's voice cut through our weariness, driving us back into order. Her commands came sharp and relentless, though I could hear the strain in her own voice. Fires had to be stoked again, kettles filled, bread needed fresh. The feast had ended, yet the labor of the castle never did. I moved with the others, slower than before, each step weighted by the fatigue that pulled at my bones. My hands were cracked, my palms blistered, but the sting mattered little. The tasks of survival left no room for complaint. I thought perhaps the cook would spare me the harder work after the trial of the night, but instead she sent me beyond the kitchen into the yard with a basket in my arms. "Go to the market," she said simply. "Bring what is needed, and do not fail." The chill outside bit into me with a sharpness different from the kitchen's heat. The yard was alive with the clatter of hooves, the calls of grooms, and the barking of dogs. Smoke drifted from the smithy, and the air carried the smell of damp earth and manure. For a moment, I was glad to be free of the suffocating kitchen, but the weight of the basket dragged heavy on my arm. I walked through the gate, and the other servants' eyes followed me, some with amusement, others with suspicion. I heard their whispers. "He was lucky last night. Let us see how long luck lasts." Their words clung to me, heavier than the basket itself. At the market, the stalls buzzed with voices and colors. Merchants cried out their prices, their hands waving over piles of fish, sacks of grain, baskets of herbs. But I had no time to marvel. The steward's purse, thrust into my hand, was small and light. Each coin clinked with painful scarcity. When I asked for flour, the merchant's eyes narrowed. His smile was sharp, his words sharper still. "That is not enough, boy," he said, as if mocking me. My face burned as others watched, laughter rising when I stumbled over my words. The market was no gentler than the kitchen. I bartered as best I could, stretching each coin until it seemed ready to snap. Every handful of grain, every strip of salted meat felt like a victory won in silence. My pride suffered blow after blow, but at last the basket filled with what I could carry. The handles dug into my arms, leaving red welts, but I clutched it tightly and turned back toward the castle. The way back felt longer than the way out, each step dragging, each stone heavier beneath my boots. When I returned to the kitchen, the air was hot and smoky again, the noise pressing against me like a wave. I set the basket down before the cook, my breath coming hard. She inspected the contents with eyes like a hawk, lifting each item, weighing it silently. I braced for her wrath, for some scolding that would crush me further. But she only nodded once and set the goods aside. That single nod, brief and wordless, meant more than any speech could have. It was as though she had marked me not as a failure, but as one who had managed to endure. Yet even in that moment of relief, I felt it the steward's eyes on me. He stood at the edge of the shadows, silent and calculating. No anger burned in his face this time, no open threat. Instead, he studied me as though I were a tool to be measured, weighed, and perhaps sharpened for some purpose I could not yet see. His gaze unsettled me more than any outburst of rage. It was the look of a man who saw value in me, though whether for good or ill I could not guess. The day stretched on, the hours blurring into one another as we cleaned, prepared, and laboured. Bread rose in the ovens, pots boiled with stews meant for the day's meals, and I was sent running from one end of the chamber to the other until my legs ached. I fetched water from the well until my shoulders screamed, split kindling until my hands bled anew, and scrubbed the stones until the grey water turned black. The others worked beside me in silence, their exhaustion as deep as mine. Yet now and then I caught them watching me, not with contempt, but with a kind of guarded curiosity. The boy who had survived the feast, the boy who had not yet broken. By midday, the sun slanted through the high windows, filling the smoky chamber with beams of gold. Dust and ash floated in the light, drifting like tiny sparks. The smell of baking bread wrapped itself around us, a comfort and a torment all at once. My stomach clenched with hunger, but I dared not steal a crumb. I had learned enough to know that every loaf was counted, every crust claimed. Hunger, like exhaustion, was simply another part of the life I had chosen, or perhaps the life that had chosen me. When the cook finally allowed us a pause, I sat against the wall, my body trembling with fatigue. I watched the others as they ate their thin stew, their eyes fixed on their bowls, too tired even for conversation. A strange calm settled over me then. The storm of the feast had passed. The chaos of the market survived, and though my body cried out, I was still here. The truth weighed heavy. But it was clear this kitchen, this castle, this life was not one trial, but a chain of them. Unending and merciless, each day would demand more. As I lifted the spoon to my lips, I felt once more the steward's gaze from across the room. His eyes lingered, sharp and unreadable, before he turned away. I did not know what he saw in me, nor what plans he carried, but I knew one thing. My place in this kitchen was no longer as invisible as it had been when I first entered. I had survived one night, one morning, one errand into the world beyond the hearth, and in doing so, I had been noticed. Whether that was a blessing or a curse, only time would tell. The castle did not sleep as deeply as it seemed, though the feast had ended, though the lords and ladies lay heavy with wine. There were always echo's guards stamping their boots in the yard, dogs barking in the dark, servants moving softly in the halls. The kitchen, too, never truly stilled. Fires were banked low, but never extinguished. The ovens breathed faint heat, and in the shadows the work continued. I had thought the day's burden done after my return from the market, after scrubbing the floors until my hands bled. But the cook's sharp voice called me again before I could sink into rest. The Lord demands a night meal, she said. A tray must go to him before dawn. Her eyes fixed on mine, heavy with warning. You will carry it. A shiver passed through me. To walk again into the Lord's hall, not as one among many, but alone, bearing food to his private chamber, it was no small task. I remembered Lord Geoffrey's laughter when he had made me taste the dish before all. His eyes, cold and probing, seemed to cut through me even now. I swallowed hard and nodded. There was no choice. The cook laid out the tray, dark bread, a wedge of sharp cheese, a dish of stewed venison rich with herbs. She placed a goblet of watered wine. Beside it, then draped a linen cloth to cover the meal. Do not stumble, she said. Do not speak. Unless spoken to, and above all, do not linger. I lifted the tray carefully, its weight both physical and heavy with meaning. Each step from the kitchen felt like a step deeper into unknown waters. The corridors of the castle stretched long and cold, torchlight flickering against the stone. Shadows twisted at the corners of my vision, and the silence pressed close. I could hear only my own breath, quick and shallow, and the steady pound of my heart. At the chamber doors, two guards stood. Their spears gleamed in the light of the torches, and their eyes bore down on me. One held out his hand and I froze. Slowly, I lifted the linen, revealing the food. He inspected each dish, sniffed the wine, then stepped aside without a word. I entered, the door closing behind me like the lid of a tomb. Lord Geoffrey reclined within, his furs draped around him, his eyes sharp despite the late hour. Papers lay scattered on the table beside him, maps and letters, a candle burning low. He was not drunk now, nor merry. He was clear-eyed, calculating, dangerous. I set the tray before him with trembling hands. "Ah," he said, his voice low, the boy who lived through the feast. His gaze cut into me, and I felt smaller than ever. "The cook trusts you, then? Perhaps she is wise, or perhaps she is a fool." He tore bread with his hands, his eyes never leaving me. The silence stretched. I waited, head bowed, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. He ate slowly, as though savoring not the food but the tension in the air. Then, at last, he spoke again. "You carried this without error. You did not falter. Good." His words were not praise, but something colder, sharper, like a blade tested on flesh. "Remember, boy, every task is a trial. Fail, and you are nothing. Endure, and perhaps you may be of use." I bowed, my head lower, the words etching themselves into me like scars. He waved me away with a flick of his hand, already turning back to his maps. I lifted the empty tray and fled the chamber, my breath only returning once the doors closed behind me. The walk back to the kitchen felt lighter, though my body still shook. When I returned, the cook looked at me in silence, her face unreadable. At last, she spoke. "So, he let you return." Her tone was flat, but beneath it I thought I heard a trace of relief. She turned away before I could answer, but I saw the corners of her mouth twitch, as though she fought to hide the faintest smile. The fires were dying now, the ovens cooling at last. The other servants had slumped against the walls, asleep where they sat. I lowered myself to the floor, the tray beside me, and let my body finally rest. My arms throbbed, my back ached, but I felt something else stirring within me, a strange strength, forged from all I had endured. Above, the bells began to toll, marking the coming of dawn. One day in the kitchen had passed, one day of endless fire, burden, and fear. Yet I had survived. I was no longer the same boy who had entered trembling, wide-eyed and uncertain. I had been broken, reshaped, and tested in ways I could never have imagined. And as the pale sun spilled once more into the chamber, I closed my eyes and whispered to myself the truth I had learned: survival was not victory, but it was enough for now. The dawn broke cold and sharp, the first light creeping over the castle walls like a blade drawn from its sheath. The air outside carried the damp scent of stone and frost, and within the kitchen, the embers of last night's fire glowed faint and weak. The great feast was behind us, yet the scars of it still clung to every corner. Ashes lay heavy in the ovens, pots blackened beyond scrubbing lined the walls, and the stench of grease and smoke lingered in the air as though it could never be chased away. I had barely closed my eyes before the cook's voice tore through the chamber once more. Sleep was no friend to us here. Her words rang out like hammer blows, demanding bread to be kneaded, broths to be set upon the fire, herbs to be cut and measured before the Lord's hall stirred awake. The castle above might lie slumbering still, but below in the kitchen there was no peace, no stillness, no pause between one day and the next. My body felt as though it had been beaten. My arms throbbed from hauling water, my palms raw with burns and blisters, my legs trembling from hours of running the night before. Yet the moment I staggered, the sharp eye of the cook found me. "On your feet," she barked. "The world does not wait for your weakness." And so I moved again, each motion driven more by instinct than strength, my body learning the rhythm of survival even as my mind begged for rest. As I worked, I began to notice the way the others looked at me. Yesterday, I had been no one, just another boy thrown into the fires of the kitchen. But after the night's trial, something had changed. Whispers stirred whenever I passed small. Sharp murmurs spoken just low enough for me not to catch every word. "That's him, the one the Lord summoned, the boy who carried the tray and came back alive." Their eyes lingered too long, filled with something between curiosity and caution. and I realized I had lost my cloak of invisibility. In the world of the kitchen, where most of us were nothing more than shadows, being noticed was dangerous, respect was as sharp as envy, and either could cut deep. One servant offered me a crumb of bread when he thought the cook wasn't looking, a gesture of quiet solidarity. But another sneered as I passed, muttering loud enough for me to hear, "Luck." That's all it was. I kept my head down, saying nothing. Survival, I had learned, was not in speaking but in enduring. The day crept on, and with it the endless work. I hauled buckets from the well until my shoulders screamed, chopped roots until my fingers stiffened, and scrubbed stones until the grey water turned black. Around me the scullions grumbled, their words weary but sharp-edged. The kitchen was a forge, burning us down to ash and shaping what remained into tools of service. Those who broke were swept away. Those who endured became something harder, something sharper. When I paused to breathe, I felt a shadow fall across me. The steward had entered, his boots ringing against the stone, his presence drawing silence from every tongue. He moved through the kitchen like a hawk circling prey, his eyes cold, his posture rigid. When his gaze fell upon me, I felt the weight of it press against my chest. He studied me not with the open scorn of before, but with a different kind of hunger, as though measuring my worth. "This one," he said at last, his voice carrying through the chamber, "the Lord may have use for him. Remember that." He turned then, leaving without another word. Yet the echo of his judgment lingered long after he had gone. The servants exchanged glances, some wary, some calculating. The cook's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Only her eyes, dark and unreadable, flicked to me for a heartbeat before returning to her work. The rest of the morning passed in a haze of labor, but my thoughts spun faster than my hands could move. What did it mean to be seen by the steward? What task lay ahead? If Lord Geoffrey himself had tested me with the knight's errand and chosen not to dismiss me outright, I had been little more than a nameless hand in the kitchen fires. But now it seemed I was caught in something larger, something far more dangerous. By midday, the sun slanted through the high windows, its light catching in the smoke that drifted lazily through the room. The smell of baking bread filled the air, heavy and warm, a torment to our empty stomachs. My hunger clawed at me, yet I dared not steal. Every loaf, every crust, every crumb belonged to the Lord's hall. To touch what was not mine would be to invite punishment, perhaps worse than any lash. When the cook finally allowed us to sit, I sank against the cold wall, my limbs trembling. The stew ladled into my bowl was thin and grey, more water than meat, yet I swallowed it greedily, each mouthful keeping me tethered to life. The others ate in silence, their heads bent, their eyes hollow. I looked at them and saw myself reflected, worn down, beaten, but not yet broken. The whispers returned when we finished, softer now but insistent. I caught fragments of talk about alliances, about letters carried into the Lord's chamber in the dead of night, about men arriving at the castle who bore no colours but carried sharp blades. The feast, it seemed, had not only been for pleasure. There were deeper games at play, and the kitchen, though lowly, was not untouched by them. I felt a chill despite the heat of the fires. The cook had told me once that survival here was not victory, only the beginning. Now I understood her words more fully. The kitchen was a test, yes, but it was also a gateway. Beyond it lay the true dangers of the castle, secrets, plots, and powers that crushed lives as easily as I crushed garlic beneath my knife. When the bell rang for the evening meal, I rose again, weary but steadier than before. The day's burden was not yet done, and tomorrow would bring more. But as I tied my apron and stepped once more into the firelit chaos, I knew this truth. I was no longer just a boy, trying to survive a day. I was part of something larger now, something that might raise me higher or destroy me completely. The morning came with a weight I could not shake. Though my body moved through the motions of work, my mind was elsewhere, pulled toward the memory of the steward's words. His voice still echoed in my skull. The Lord may have use for him. What use could a boy like me serve except as another pair of hands to carry, to scrub, to sweat? Yet the thought would not leave me. Something had shifted, and the air itself felt different, heavier with unseen things. The kitchen roared with life once again. Flames licked the blackened hearth, pots bubbled and spat, knives struck wood in steady rhythm, and the smell of onions and garlic clung to the smoke-filled air. The cook moved like a commander on the battlefield, her orders sharp, her eyes everywhere at once. For most, this place was the whole world, the center of existence, and they moved within it as though chained to its stones. But for me, the kitchen now felt like a cage holding me on the edge of something vast, something dangerous. As I bent over the table, slicing loaves of bread into precise pieces, I heard the door open. Heavy boots struck the stone, slow and deliberate. The room fell quiet, the only sound the hiss of roasting meat. I looked up, and there he was, the steward, his face carved in stone, his eyes fixed on me. My stomach clenched. He didn't speak to the cook, nor to any of the older servants. Instead, his finger lifted and pointed directly at me. "You. Come." The cook's eyes narrowed, but she did not protest. Perhaps she knew better. Perhaps she understood the resistance here was useless. My hands trembled as I set down the knife, wiped them quickly on my apron, and followed him out of the kitchen. Every gaze burned into my back, some filled with envy, others with silent pity. Whatever waited for me beyond that door was mine alone to face. The steward led me through the narrow passageways of the castle, where the air grew cooler, less burdened by smoke and sweat. Torches flickered along the walls, casting long shadows that twisted and danced as though alive. I had rarely ventured this far from the kitchen. The stone beneath my feet seemed harder, cleaner, as though even the ground itself knew it belonged to another world. We climbed a short stair, and the sound of laughter drifted faintly from the hall above. Noble voices, light and careless, so different from the sharp cries and clatter of the servants. My heart hammered as we approached a heavy oak door bound with iron. The steward paused, glancing at me with that same measuring look he always carried. Then, without a word, he pushed the door open. The chamber within was lit with golden light, the fire in the hearth casting warmth across tapestries that lined the walls. The air smelled of wine and rich meats, though no feast was laid. At the far end of the room, seated in a tall chair carved with intricate patterns, was Lord Geoffrey himself. His presence filled the space like a storm cloud, heavy and commanding, even though he did not rise. His eyes were sharp, his mouth set in a line that betrayed nothing. The steward bowed low, and I followed clumsily, unsure of the proper depth. My knees ached against the stone, but I dared not lift my head until the silence was broken. "So," Lord Geoffrey said at last, his voice smooth but edged, "this is the boy." I felt his gaze weigh me down, stripping away whatever scraps of courage I had left. He leaned forward slightly, studying me as though I were not a person but an object to be tested, a tool to be used. "They say you carried out your task last night without faltering." His words hung in the air, and I swallowed hard, unsure if I was meant to answer. "Yes, my lord," I whispered, my voice hoarse. A faint smile curved his lips, not warmth, but something colder. "Good. Obedience is a virtue I value." He gestured to the steward, who stepped forward and placed a sealed parchment on the table beside him. "I have another task for you, one that requires silence, speed, and above all, loyalty. Can you provide me that?" My throat was dry, my palms slick with sweat, but I forced myself to nod. "Yes, my lord." He leaned back in his chair, the firelight catching the sharp planes of his face. "We shall see." He motioned to the steward, who picked up the parchment and placed it in my hands. The wax seal was thick, stamped with the sigil of the house. The weight of it felt heavier than it should, as though I held not paper, but the fate of something larger than myself. "You will carry this beyond the castle walls," Geoffrey said, his voice low but clear. "You will place it directly into the hands of Sir Ulrich at the northern tower. Speak to no one of it. Fail, and you will not return." My breath caught. The northern tower lay beyond the gates, outside the walls that had been my prison and my shelter. I had never stepped into the world beyond the castle shadow. The thought filled me with both terror and a strange, flickering hope. I bowed again, clutching the parchment tightly. "It will be done, my lord." Geoffrey's smile returned, thin and sharp as a blade. "Good. Go now." The steward led me from the chamber, his steps quick, his silence heavier than words. When we returned to the kitchen, every eye turned toward me, searching for clues, for secrets. But I said nothing. I tucked the parchment beneath my apron, the seal pressing into my ribs, a reminder of the burden I now carried. The cook's gaze met mine, sharp and knowing. She said nothing, but I caught the flicker of warning in her eyes. Perhaps she understood more than she let on. Perhaps she knew that stepping beyond the kitchen's walls meant stepping into dangers no fire or knife could prepare me for. As the afternoon wore on, the weight of the parchment grew heavier with each passing hour. The noise of the kitchen faded around me, replaced by the sound of my own heartbeat, steady and insistent. Tonight, I would leave the kitchen. Tonight, I would step into a world I had only imagined. And tonight, survival would mean far more than keeping pace with the cook's commands. It would mean facing the unknown, carrying secrets that could change the course of more than just my own life. For the first time since I had entered the castle's kitchen, I realized that my fate was no longer bound only to fire and bread. It was tied now to the unseen currents of power that flowed through these stone halls, currents that could raise me up or pull me under forever. The heavy groan of the castle gates echoed behind me, and then the world was silent. For the first time since I had been dragged into that kitchen, I stood beyond the walls with nothing between me and the night, the sealed letter pressed against my chest with every breath, as if reminding me of its weight, its purpose, its danger. The road stretched ahead in a ribbon of pale stone, swallowed quickly by the black trees that loomed like sentinels on either side. Above, the moon was thin and sharp, breaking through branches in fractured beams of silver. The air was cold enough to bite my lungs, and each breath I took seemed to echo too loudly in the stillness. At first, there was comfort in the quiet. After the clamor of pots and the constant orders of the kitchen, the forest seemed almost peaceful. But the longer I walked, the more that silence pressed in on me until it felt like the air itself was listening. I thought of the men I had passed earlier, crouched around their fire with knives at their belts and cruel laughter on their lips. Bandits owned these roads. If they caught me with the parchment, I would be stripped of both my task and my life. The steward had warned me in few words, but he had said nothing of this. Perhaps he had known. Perhaps this was part of the trial. The letter's wax seal burned cold against my skin. I dared not even look at it, yet its presence haunted me. Somewhere within was a message too important for a servant to know, too dangerous for a boy like me to carry. Yet here I was, chosen not for strength but because I was invisible, forgettable, a shadow no one would miss if I failed. And yet tonight, I was no shadow. Tonight the darkness itself seemed to follow me. The first time I heard it, I told myself it was nothing. A branch falling, a fox moving through the brush. But then I heard it again. A soft crunch, perfectly in rhythm with my steps, pausing when I paused, resuming when I moved. I froze on the path, heart hammering, ears straining for the faintest sound. Nothing. Only the whisper of leaves above, the mournful cry of an owl in the distance. Slowly, I forced my feet forward again, and again the sound followed. Fear crawled across my skin. I turned once, staring down the path behind me, but the road lay empty, bathed in silver light, still. The sense of eyes upon me refused to fade. My legs grew heavy with both dread and hunger. In the kitchen, scraps had always been within reach, bowls to lick, bones to gnaw. Out here there was nothing. My stomach twisted angrily, but fear kept me moving. To stop would be to surrender. At last I stumbled across a stream. Moonlight shimmered across its surface, and I dropped to my knees, scooping handfuls of icy water to my lips. The relief was sharp, almost painful, but fleeting. For when I lowered my gaze, I saw the prints, boot prints, pressed deep into the mud by the bank, the marks of a heavy step. Larger than mine, fresher than the fallen leaves around them. My blood turned to ice. Someone had been here before me, or perhaps they were still here. I raised my head quickly, eyes scanning the trees. The shadows seemed to lean closer, shifting when I blinked. My ears caught it again breathing, slow and deliberate, close but hidden. I staggered back from the water, clutching the parchment as though I could shield it with my arms. The steward's words rang in my skull. Fail, and you will not return. Failure was death, but now success seemed no safer. Still, I could not stop. I forced my feet back onto the path. though every step felt like an invitation to the unseen presence behind me. The branches above creaked in the wind, but even their groaning seemed like whispers, warnings. The sound of footsteps came and went, sometimes faint, sometimes close enough to tighten my throat with terror. Whoever followed me was skilled, patient, watching. I did not dare run. To run was to tire, to stumble, to fall, and if I fell, the shadow that stalked me would strike. So I walked on with steady pace, though fear gnawed at me with each stride. The night grew colder, and the forest pressed tighter. The trees crowded the path, their limbs tangled like blackened claws. Every flicker of moonlight became a trick, every shift of darkness a threat. My own breath felt like the loudest sound in the world. An owl cried again, long and mournful, and I shivered. The sound seemed less like nature and more like a warning. I thought of turning back, but there was nothing for me behind those walls now. Only punishment, only chains. So I pressed forward, clutching the letter so tightly my fingers ached. The northern tower lay somewhere beyond the horizon, hidden by trees and night, but I would reach it. I had to reach it. Yet deep in my bones, I knew one truth I could not deny. I was not alone on this road. The first pale light of dawn spread across the forest, touching the branches with silver. After hours of stumbling through the darkness, my eyes almost stung at the sight of morning. I had walked all night, chased by shadows, hunted by fear, tested by a watcher whose presence had vanished before dawn. My legs trembled beneath me, my breath came ragged, but I did not stop. The road had led me here, and ahead at last I saw it, the northern tower. It rose above the horizon, dark against the growing sky, its stone walls catching the weak light of day. My heart surged with relief and dread in equal measure. I had survived the kitchen, the smoke, the endless toil. I had endured the long night, the whispers in the trees, the unseen eyes that judged my every step. Now only one task remained. Deliver the letter. The road narrowed as it climbed, winding upward through sparse trees and sharp rocks. Each step felt heavier than the last, but the thought of the tower pulled me on. My boots slipped on loose stones, my cloak hung heavy with damp, but I would not falter now. When I reached the outer gates, two guards barred my way. Their spears crossed before me, and their eyes narrowed at the sight of a ragged boy, clothes torn, face streaked with dirt. "State your business," one demanded, his voice rough with suspicion. I fumbled for the parchment, my hands trembling. The seal of wax gleamed faintly in the morning light, and at the sight of it, the men stiffened. They exchanged a glance, then lifted their spears. Without another word, they swung the gates open. Inside, the air was colder, stiller, as though the tower itself was carved from silence. Stone walls rose high, lined with narrow windows that let in only slivers of light. I was led across a long hall where the sound of my footsteps echoed against the flagstones. At the far end of the chamber sat a man before a low fire. He was broad-shouldered, his cloak trimmed with fur, his presence heavy enough to silence the room. His eyes lifted as I approached, sharp and steady, taking in every detail of me, the dirt, the exhaustion, the fear I could not hide. With trembling hands, I placed the sealed parchment before him. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he reached forward, fingers steady, and broke the seal. The crack of wax splitting echoed louder than I expected, as though the world itself listened. His gaze moved across the page. I could not see what was written there, nor did I dare to try. My stomach twisted as the silence stretched. At last, he lowered the parchment and looked at me. "You carried this through the night," he said, his voice low, deliberate. "Alone. Few men could have done the same." I bowed my head, unable to answer. Words caught in my throat, tangled with exhaustion. My body cried for food, for rest, yet beneath the hunger something else burned. I had survived. The kitchen had not broken me. The night had not claimed me. I was still standing. The man's gaze lingered. "You were sent to be tested," he continued, "and you endured. That is all that matters." The weight of his words sank deep. Tested. I thought of the watcher in the woods, of the eyes that had followed me, judging every step. It had never been only about the letter. It had been about me, about whether I was strong enough to carry a burden greater than scraps and soot. The man nodded once, final and sure. "Rest now. Your part is done." But remember this: once chosen, you cannot return to what you were. I swallowed hard, my heart thudding in my chest. I thought of the kitchen, of the endless clatter of pots, the taste of stale bread, the lash of orders shouted at me. I thought of the boy I had been then, hungry, invisible, small. That boy was gone now. The forest had stripped him away. The letter had burned him away. What remained was someone different. The chamber was still, the fire crackling softly. I felt its warmth brush against me, but the chill of the night clung to my bones. I turned, stepping back into the hall, the man's words still echoing. Once chosen, you cannot return. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, washing the tower walls in pale gold. The shadows of the forest stretched far behind me, but I carried them still, tucked deep within my memory. I had survived the kitchen, the toil, the hunger. I had survived the night, the watcher, the fear. I had delivered the letter. The road that had begun with fire and smoke ended here, before the tower gates. Yet, as I looked upon the rising sun, I knew it was not truly the end. It was the beginning of something greater, though I could not yet name it. I took a breath of the cold morning air, steadying myself. My story in the kitchen was over. My story on the road was over. But my life had only just begun.